So, picture this. It's 1947. There's this teenager. Some accounts say he's 15, some say a little older, wandering along the cliffs above the Dead Sea, looking for a lost goat. Not on a mission, not an archaeologist, just a kid with a problem and time on his hands. He throws a rock into a crack in the cliff, just to hear if anything's in there, and instead of silence, he hears something break. Inside that cave, which hadn't been touched in roughly 2,000 years, were clay jars, sealed, still intact. And inside those jars were scrolls. Now, most people know the broad strokes of what happened next. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the discovery that shocked biblical scholarship, the manuscripts that pushed our knowledge of ancient texts back by 1,000 years. But here's what most people don't know. One of those scrolls, a fragment barely the length of your forearm, found specifically in Cave 11, wasn't just a religious text or a copy of scripture. It was something weirder than that. It read like a technical document, a schematic, a countdown. It describes a specific sequence of time periods. It named a specific agent who would appear at the end of those periods. It connected that agent to an ancient system of measuring history that the people who wrote it believed was embedded in the very structure of creation. And the endpoint of that countdown, the moment the document is pointing toward, is not thousands of years away. It's now. Welcome. If you're new here, I'm genuinely glad you found this channel. This is a space for going deep on ancient texts, buried history, the questions that serious researchers ask and that most mainstream coverage skips over entirely. Not sensationalism, not fear-mongering. Real material treated with seriousness it actually deserves. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe right now, because the content pipeline is full. One quick thing before we get into it. This channel is not yet monetized. YouTube has a threshold you have to cross before they turn ads on, and we are not yet there. So, if you get value from what we make here and you want to help keep it going, there's a link in the description to buy me a coffee page. Literally $5. Nobody's going to guilt trip you, and there are no exclusive tiers or paywalls. Just a way to say, keep going, in a language that actually keeps servers running. Alright, let's get back to the cave. Before we can talk about the scroll and what it says, we need to talk about the Jubilee. And I want to do this properly, because most people who've heard the word Jubilee know just enough of the surface version to think they understand it, and the surface version completely misses why it matters. The Jubilee comes from Leviticus 25. There's the chapter where the whole system gets laid out in detail. And yes, the basic concept is familiar. Every 50 years, debts are cancelled, slaves are freed, land goes back to its original owner. A giant economic reset. A societal do-over. Great, we know that part. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The architecture of how you get to 50. You don't just count to 50 and blow the trumpet. The structure underneath it is much more deliberate than that. You start by counting 7 years. That seventh year, the Shemitah, is a Sabbath word for the land. Farmers let their fields rest. Debts between Israelites are released. Servants can go free. It's a built-in pressure valve for the economy, scheduled like clockwork. Then you count 7 of those 7-year cycles, 7 Shemitahs. That gets you to year 49. And then, the year after the end of the 7th 7 is the Jubilee, year 50. So, The mathematical structure is 7 times 7 plus 1. 49 years of cycle, and then a year that stands outside the pattern. A year that doesn't belong to the normal count. The 50th year is almost an interruption. A moment of time that resets everything before the next cycle begins. Now, why does that matter? Because the people who designed this system, or if you're coming from a theological angle, the tradition that received it, were building something that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface level, it's a social policy, stops generational wealth inequality, stops the permanent enslavement of the poor. Every 50 years, the playing field levels out. Practical, radical, actually for any ancient community. But on a deeper level, and this is where the ancient writers themselves lived, the Jubilee was understood as a cosmic structure, not just a law for a nation, but a rhythmic woven into time itself. Here's the detail that hits different once you sit with it. Israel basically never consistently kept the Jubilee. You can search through the historical records of Israel, through kings, through chronicles, through the prophets, and you find almost no solid evidence of a formal national Jubilee being declared and observed in the way Leviticus 25 describes. There are references to Shemitah years here and there. There's a famous passage where Jeremiah connects the Babylon exile directly to Israel's failure to observe the Shemitah. He says, God was effectively collecting the land's Sabbath years as back payment, 1 year per missed cycle, which would be 70 years for 90 years of non-observance. That's a staggering implication. The system is still counting. The debt is still accumulating. Just because Israel stopped observing the calendar doesn't mean the calendar stopped. The rabbis of the Talmudic period later tried to work this out. There's a debate in the Talmud about where exactly the Jubilee stopped being applicable. Some said it stopped being obligatory once the full 12 tribes weren't all in the land. Others debated the specifics of which Shemitah year was current. The point is, everyone agreed it had gotten complicated. The official count had, at some point, become unclear. But one group didn't let it get complicated. One group kept meticulous track of exactly where they were on the clock. And they lived in the desert, copying scrolls into clay jars. The Essenes. The Essenes were a Jewish sect that separated themselves from the Jerusalem temple establishment, probably somewhere around 150 to 100 BC, because they believed the temple priests had made a catastrophic error. Specifically, they had switched to a lunar calendar. This might sound like a small technical disagreement. It was not. To the Essenes, the calendar wasn't just an administrative convenience. It was theological bedrock. The Book of Jubilees, one of their most sacred texts, found in multiple copies at Qumran, opens with a warning. It says that future generations will be led astray by observing the moon rather than the sun, and that this will cause them to profane the Sabbaths and festivals and jubilees. It calls this corruption. The Essenes ran on a solar calendar, 364 days, exactly 52 weeks. The genius of this system is that every single festival falls on exactly the same day of the week, every single year. No drift, no adjustment, perfect regularity. And this calendar ran on Jubilee cycles the way a clock runs on gears. The entire framework of history was structured around it. Dr. Ken Johnson, a researcher who has done extensive reconstruction work on the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, has worked out that the Essenes divided all of human history into ages. Each age is 2,000 years. Each age is made up of 40 Jubilee cycles, and at the end of each age, there is a Final Jubilee, the last 50-year period before the transition. In their framework, we are currently in what they call the Age of Grace. It runs roughly from 75 AD to 2075 AD, and the final 50-year Jubilee of this age, the last chapter, if you want to think of it that way, begins in the spring of 2025 with the new Jubilee year opening formally on the Dead Sea Scroll calendar in March 2026. Now, here's the thing I want you to sit with for a moment. Everything I've described so far, the Jubilee month, the 7 times 7 structure, the Essene calendar, the 50-year ages, that was all being written down before 200 and 100 BC. Centuries before most of the events we'd consider modern. Centuries before 1948 and 1967, which our dates will come back to. And one document from that period didn't just record how far the calendar works. It applied the calendar to a very particular claim. It named a specific figure. It described a specific role. And it gave a specific time maker, expressed in Jubilee cycles, for when that figure would act. The document was found in Cave 11, the one the shepherd kid cracked open by accident. And when scholars first translated it in the 1960s and 70s, they were not quite sure what category to put it in, because it isn't a psalm, it isn't a list of rules, it reads like a prophetic blueprint, a detonator with a timer attached. The document is called 11Q Melchizedek, and what it says about the 10th Jubilee is something most people who discuss end-time prophecy have never once heard of. Stay with me. 11Q Melch. That's the scholar's shorthand. Manuscript 13 from the Cave 11 at Qumran, dated to approximately 100 BC. It's fragmentary. Columns 1 and 3 are barely readable, but column 2 is largely intact, and column 2 is where the clock lives. The document is structured as a peshar, which is a Hebrew word for a commentary, but not the way we use commentary today. A peshar takes an ancient text and pulls out what the writer believes is its hidden, eschatological meaning, its real-world prophetic application. The Qumran community wrote pesharim on Isaiah, on Habakkuk, on Psalms, and they read those texts as addressing their own time, the end of the age. 11Q Melchizedek takes 3 texts, Leviticus 25, Isaiah 61, and Daniel 9, and weaves them together into a single argument about the structure of the end. Here's the argument broken down. It opens by citing Leviticus 25 on the Jubilee, the year of the release, the return to one's inheritance, the cancellation of debts. But then it immediately reframes this. It says the Jubilee law, properly understood, is not just about land and economics. It's about something far larger. It's about the captives, a term that, in the prophetic framework, refers to those held captive by sin, by the powers of darkness. And the agent of their liberation is Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is a figure who appears only briefly in Genesis 14 and Psalms 110 in the Hebrew Bible. But the Qumran community treated him as a major theological player. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, he shows up in multiple documents. And in 11Q Melchizedek, he is portrayed not as a human priest, but as a heavenly being, an angelic figure who leads the sons of light in a war against Belial, the figure of evil and darkness. The name Melchizedek literally means king of righteousness in Hebrew. His opponent, Belial, is sometimes called Melchiresha, which means the king of wickedness. The document is staging a cosmic confrontation between these two figures, and it's placing that confrontation at a very specific point in time. The text says, "This will happen in the first week of the Jubilee that follows the 9 Jubilees. And the day of the atonement is the end of the 10th Jubilee." Read that again. 9 Jubilees complete. The 10th begins. The first 7-year period, the first week of years. Inside that 10th Jubilee is when Melchizedek acts. And the day of the atonement, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Hebrew calendar, the day of ultimate accounting, falls on the end of the 10th. 10 Jubilees. Each Jubilee is 49 years. 10 times 49 is for 90 years. 490 years. If you know Daniel 9, even slightly, that number just rang a bell. Because Daniel 9 gives the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And 70 weeks of years, in the Hebrew structure, where a week is 7 years, is 490 years. Exactly. That is not a coincidence that scholars dismiss. This is something they take seriously. Professor Joseph Fitzmyer, one of the leading Dead Sea Scrolls scholars of the 20th century, explicitly noted that 11Q Melchizedek appears to be drawing on Daniel's 70 weeks framework. Florentino Garcia Martinez and other leading Qumran researchers have made the same connection. The 10 Jubilees in the Melchizedek scroll are almost certainly intended to map onto Daniel's 490-year structure. And here's why that matters so much. Because it means you have two completely separate documents, written in different genres by possibly different authors from different traditions, that are independently pointing to the same mathematical endpoint. Daniel says 70 weeks of years, and then God wraps things up. 11Q Melchizedek says 10 Jubilees, and then Melchizedek acts on the Day of Atonement. Same number, different language, same conclusion. The Qumran community apparently understood this, and they considered themselves to be the people living through the final stretch of it. However, there's one more element in this document that I think deserves more airtime than it usually gets. The scroll explicitly says the liberation Melchizedek proclaims is connected to Isaiah 61. That passage, and I quote, "To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor," end of quote, is the same passage that Jesus reads in the synagogue in Nazareth in Luke chapter 4 when he's just starting his ministry. He reads it, rolls up the scroll and says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." The Qumran community expected the proclamation of the final Jubilee to come from this figure. The early followers of Jesus believed he had already begun it. The question the scroll leaves open, the question that's been hanging in the air for 2,000 years, is fulfilled in what sense? Begun? Partially fulfilled? Or is there a completion event still to come? That's a theological question I'm not going to answer for you. But it's a real question. And it's the one that the 11Q Melchizedek scroll is sitting at the center of it. What I will say is this. The Essenes wrote down their expectation. They buried it in a cave. 2,000 years later, a teenager with a lost goat found it. And it says the 10th Jubilee is when things reach their end point. So, here's what keeps me up about all this. The Jubilee framework. The idea that history is structured in 50-year cycles and that those cycles lead somewhere specific. It doesn't just appear in Qumran. It's only the Essenes who built their worldview around it. Because there's another place the same structure shows up. Different century, different country, different tradition entirely. Medieval Germany, 800 years ago, about events that were going to happen in a land he'd never visited, involving a political empire that had barely started forming when he was alive. And then, for 5 centuries, absolutely nothing happened that looked like a confirmation. And then, all at once, everything he predicted happened. In Jubilee precise, 50-year intervals, in exactly the right sequence. And the window he was describing, the one at the very end, that's now. Rabbi Judah ben Samuel, sometimes called Judah he Hasid, Judah the Pious, was a medieval Jewish mystic and a scholar based in Regensburg, Germany, in the 12th century. By all accounts, he was one of the most respected Torah scholars of his era. However, he died in 1217. Before he died, he made a prediction about Jerusalem, and the prediction was structured entirely around Jubilee cycles, using Jerusalem as the axis point and the Ottoman Turks as the trigger. Here's the problem. In 1217, the Ottoman Turks were not yet a major power. They existed. They were a presence on the Bosphorus. But they hadn't conquered anything substantial yet. They were a regional force, not an empire. And they certainly hadn't taken Jerusalem. But the rabbi's prophecy went like this, and I quote, "When the Ottomans conquer Jerusalem, they will rule over it for 8 jubilees, 400 years. Afterwards, Jerusalem will become no man's land for 1 jubilee, that is 50 years. Then, in the 9th jubilee, it will come back into the position of the Jewish nation. And that will signal the beginning of the Messianic end time." End of quote. That's the prophecy. Let's run it against history. 1517. 300 years after the rabbi's death, the Ottoman Turks under Salim conquer Jerusalem. The prophecy clicks into motion. They rule it for exactly 400 years, 8 jubilees of 50 years each. 1917. British General Edmund Allenby. And this is one of those historical details that makes you pause. Rides into Jerusalem in 1917 on Hanukkah. The Ottoman era in the Holy Land is over. Exactly 400 years, 8 jubilees to the year. But here's where it gets stranger still. From 1917 to 1947, the British hold the mandate over Palestine under League of Nations authority. Jerusalem is technically under international administration, belonging to no specific nation's sovereignty. Then comes the 1948 War of Independence. Israel declares statehood. But even then, Jerusalem is divided. The Old City, the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, the ancient core, stays under Jordanian control. And between Israeli-controlled West Jerusalem and Jordanian-controlled East Jerusalem, there is a literal strip of territory that both sides officially called No Man's Land. No Man's Land for 50 years, 1 Jubilee, from 1917 to 1967. 1967. The Six-Day War. June. Israel captured East Jerusalem. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the full city of Jerusalem is under Jewish sovereignty. The ninth Jubilee begins, and the rabbi said this would signal the beginning of the Messianic end time. And then one final Jubilee, 1967 to 2017, 50 years. The convergence of that ancient calendar marker with an astronomical event of this scale landing on exactly that date is, at minimum, the kind of thing worth noting. Here's the honest summary of where we are. Multiple independent ancient sources. The Melchizedek scroll from Cave 11, the Essene solar calendar reconstructed from Dead Sea Scrolls, the Jubilee-based prophecy framework attributed to Rabbi John ben Samuel, and the 70 Jubilee count from the Exodus tradition. All produce calculations that land on the same approximate window, 2025 to the early 2030s. The Essene calendar predicted the establishment of Israel in 1948. That document was found in 1947, before it happened. It predicted the recapture of Jerusalem in 1967. Those aren't interruptions that were applied after the fact. The calendar framework was laid out before anyone knew. I'm not here to tell you what any of this means. I genuinely don't know what it means either, and I am suspicious of anyone who claims with certainty that they do. What the ancient text actually says is, there is a structure to time. That structure is organized around Jubilee cycles, and we are in what that structure identifies as its final chapter. What happens in the final chapter? The writers who built this framework believed the liberation of captives, the cancellation of debts, a reckoning, and the beginning of something new. Whether you read that literally, symbolically, spiritually, or even historically, what's clear is that the people who designed this text thought it mattered enormously. They thought it was worth preserving, worth hiding in cages until someone found it. Someone did find it. A kid with a lost goat in 1947. And here we are. Okay, let's land this plane. What I want you to take away from this is not a date, not a prediction, not a warning panic or to prepare bankers or any of that energy. What I want you to take away is an appreciation for how serious and how specific these ancient documents actually are. The Jubilee framework isn't a vague spiritual metaphor. It's mathematics. It's calendar architecture. The people who built it, whether you believe they were divinely inspired or simply extremely meticulous, were building something they intended to last. Something that would still be readable and still be pointing at something thousands of years later. And when you line up the 11Q Melchizedek scrolls, 10 Jubilees against Daniel's 70 weeks and get the same number. When you run the Essene calendar forward and it lands on the 1948 and 1967 before those events happened. When Rabbi Judah ben Samuel's 800-year-old Jubilee count hits Ottoman rule, then British mandate, then Israeli sovereignty in exactly 50-year intervals, the honest response isn't to explain all of that away. The honest response is to pay attention. This is the kind of material this channel is built for. Not to terrify you, not to convince you of a specific theology, to give you the full picture, the depth, the history, the scholarly context, and trust to think it through. If this kind of depth is what you came here for, subscribe. Seriously, it takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm that this content is worth showing to people who would actually value it. That's how the channel grows, and that's how we get to keep making it. Drop a comment below, tell me what landed, tell me what you disagree with, tell me what you want us to go deeper on. I read the comments, and they genuinely shape what we make next. And if you want to put a small financial vote behind what we're doing, $5 on Buy Me a Coffee, link in the description. No algorithm pressure, no sponsor read, no 15-second unspeakable pitch, just a direct line from you to more content. Like tipping the person who just spent 3 hours explaining ancient Jewish calendar systems to you at a bar at midnight. Which, honestly, I would absolutely do. And I think some of you would too. See you in the next one.